The farmer is stunned when his dog gives birth to a human baby boy. How could this even be possible? What chilling secret lies beneath this bizarre event? Josh Brooklyn, a man in his early 30s, his face perpetually serious, his gaze distant, and his words scarce, as if the weight of silence suited him better than conversation. Many describe Josh as arrogant, a man who considered himself above others. When he drove his massive black truck through town, no one got a wave or even a glance. But it hadn't always been that way. There was a time when Josh was a man quick to laugh, someone who loved gathering friends around a campfire and planning the future with Eliana, his wife. Josh and Eliana had been inseparable, two young souls brimming with dreams, building what seemed like a perfect life together. That life came to a crashing halt when Eliana started to get sick. At first, the signs were subtle, but within weeks they were impossible to ignore. A visit to the doctor delivered a devastating diagnosis. Eliana had cancer. At first, she managed to keep her spirits high, assuring Josh that they would face it together. He spared no expense, pouring money into doctors, medication, and experimental treatments. They traveled to the best hospitals across the country, exhausting every option to save the woman he loved. "Promise me something, Josh," she said one night in a fragile voice. "Promise me you won't shut yourself off from the world." Josh made the promise, but he never intended to keep it. When Eliana passed away, the grief swallowed him whole. He became a shadow of the man he once was, retreating from friends, the town, and anything that reminded him of the life they had shared. He isolated himself on his ranch, surrounded only by his animals and the vast, empty fields. That morning, as he rode his horse, Zeus, across the sprawling property, Josh felt the familiar weight of emptiness pressing on him. Reaching the top of a hill with a clear view of the ranch, he paused. The house in the distance was grand and imposing, but as hollow as he felt inside. He let out a heavy sigh, tightened Zeus's reins, and began the descent. Little did he know that his life was on the verge of a change he could never foresee. Josh guided Zeus along a winding path through the soybean fields, the quiet only broken by the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves. Once at the corral, he went through his routine, checking the cattle, inspecting the fences, ensuring everything was in order. This routine was his way of keeping his mind busy, avoiding thoughts that weighed too heavily. Amid his daily habits, he found solace in the loyal companionship of Lily, his mixed-breed dog. With her ever-alert ears and deep, expressive brown eyes, she seemed to understand Josh's emotions better than anyone. He and Eliana had found her years earlier during a visit to town. Eliana had spotted the scruffy, thin dog curled up beside a dumpster. "Josh, look at her," she said, her voice filled with compassion. Before he could protest, Eliana had already scooped the trembling dog into her arms. "She needs us," she declared. From that day on, Lily became part of their family. Eliana spoiled her with scraps of meat during dinner and made sure she always had a cozy spot to sleep, though Lily often ended up on their bed, nestled between them. After Eliana's death, Lily was the last thread connecting Josh to those happier times. She followed him everywhere, as though afraid he might vanish too. Recently, Josh had noticed changes in Lily. She was quieter, her appetite had grown, and her belly was beginning to swell. Louis, the ranch's cook, had been the first to comment. "She's pregnant, boss," she said matter-of-factly. Month by month, Lily's belly grew, and Josh found himself anticipating the arrival of the puppies with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Yet, nature often works in mysterious ways, and events soon took an unexpected turn. Lily's behavior began to shift. Normally glued to Josh's side, she started spending more time resting, alternating between moments of restlessness and complete stillness. She occasionally whimpered, not out of pain, but as if something within her was changing. Josh knew the time was near and became even more attentive, ensuring her every need was met. Life on the ranch continued its calm rhythm, but that morning felt different. Josh awoke early to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the kitchen, where Louis was already preparing the day's meals. Stretching, he slipped on the boots he kept by his bed and headed for the kitchen. As he passed through the living room, his eyes instinctively drifted to the corner where Lily usually slept. But her bed was empty. Josh glanced toward the open kitchen door, half expecting her to trot in, but the silence remained. "Have you seen Lily this morning, Louis?" he finally asked. Louis shook her head. "Not today, boss," she replied. Josh frowned. It wasn't like Lily to be missing in the morning. He finished his coffee quickly and rose from his seat, determined to find her. He started in the courtyard, calling her name several times. Then he searched through the house, checking under furniture and behind doors, but there was no sign of the dog. When he returned to the kitchen, Louis gave him a curious look. "Maybe she's gone off to find a quiet spot," she suggested, wiping her hands on her apron. When they're close to giving birth, animals tend to seek out somewhere private. Josh knew she was right, but he couldn't shake the tight feeling in his chest at the thought of Lily being alone, about to give birth. He started with the orchard, one of Lily's favorite places, but the area was empty. He called her name, straining to hear even a faint bark, but all he heard was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then it hit him. If Lily was looking for privacy, she might have gone to the barn. Josh quickened his pace toward the barn, his heavy boots leaving prints in the dirt. He tried to keep his thoughts from spiraling, but the knot of anxiety in his stomach grew tighter with each step. That's when he saw it, dark, uneven stains dotting the path ahead. He stopped, staring at the fresh drops of blood. His heart pounded in his chest. The trail led straight to the barn door. "Lily," he whispered hoarsely, his entire body tensing. Without thinking, he broke into a run. Pushing the barn door open with a loud creak, he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the wooden slats. "Lily!" he called out, his voice rough, almost pleading. In the far corner of the barn, on a bed of straw, he spotted her. Lily lay on her side, panting heavily, surrounded by small, wiggling bodies. Josh exhaled a shaky breath, relieved to see the puppies and that Lily was alive. But as he stepped closer, something made him freeze. Among the puppies was something entirely unexpected. Small, wrapped in soft pink skin, with tiny arms and legs moving sluggishly. Josh blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him. But it wasn't an illusion. There, nestled among the litter, was a human baby. He stood rooted in place, his body stiff as if struck by lightning. The baby was so small it could fit in the palm of his hand. It lay next to the puppies as if it belonged there, and, to Josh's astonishment, the baby appeared to be nursing from Lily. She looked at the infant with the same gentle care she gave her pups. Josh's heart pounded so hard he could feel it echoing in his chest. How could this be? How could his dog have a human baby? He took another step forward, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of the impossible scene before him. This can't be real," he murmured, his voice cracking. He crouched down, examining the scene more closely. The puppies were there, healthy and moving, but the baby... It was no mistake. A sound from the back of the barn caught his attention. Grabbing the shotgun leaning against the nearby wall, he lifted it cautiously. Josh moved toward the dark corner of the barn, where hay bales and tools were piled high. He heard a faint, muffled sob. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp. "Show yourself!" There was a brief pause before something shifted behind the hay. Josh felt sweat trickle down his temple as a figure slowly emerged. It was a woman. She looked young, her face pale and her hair disheveled. Her hands trembled as she raised them in surrender, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice weak. Josh stared at her, his breathing uneven. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Is this your baby?" he demanded, his tone harsh but laced with disbelief. Tears welled in her eyes as she stammered through her sobs. "Yes, he's mine," she admitted. She took a hesitant step forward but froze when she saw the shotgun. "Please, I didn't mean to frighten anyone. I didn't know what else to do," she pleaded. Josh stood motionless, struggling to process the scene. He glanced back at the baby, then at the woman. "You gave birth here, in my barn?" he asked, his voice still firm but less sharp. She nodded slowly. I was running. I had nowhere else to go. I'm sorry." Silence filled the barn, stretching into an eternity. Josh finally lowered the shotgun, his eyes never leaving her. He could see the fear etched into her face, but there was something else too, an overwhelming exhaustion and desperation. "Running from what?" he asked, his voice softer now. She looked down, her tears falling silently. "From my boyfriend," she whispered. "Running from your boyfriend?" he repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. She nodded, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as if shielding her body from the very words she spoke. He used to hit me," she said, her voice trembling. "And he said, when the baby was born, he'd throw him away." Her voice broke as the last word spilled out. Josh felt something tighten in his chest. Was it anger? Sympathy? Maybe a mix of both. Slowly, he lowered the shotgun and leaned it against the barn wall before taking a step forward. The woman instinctively stepped back, shrinking into herself like a cornered animal. "Relax," he said, trying to sound less rigid, though his tone still carried an inherent edge. "No one here is going to hurt you." She hesitated, her eyes darting up to him, weighing whether she could trust his words. Josh tilted his chin toward the baby, now peacefully asleep beside Lily. "And what did you do?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You left your baby there with my dog? Why?" Tears streamed down her face again, uncontrollable and raw. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go back home. He would have killed us both." She paused, inhaling shakily to steady herself. "When I got here and saw your dog nursing her puppies, she seemed so gentle, so warm. I thought maybe she could nurse my baby too. I just wanted him to have a chance, for someone to find him and care for him." Josh swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat as he listened. His eyes shifted back to Lily, who tended to her puppies and the baby with the same tenderness, as if there was no distinction between them. The sight was both profoundly moving and unsettling. "And you?" Josh finally asked, his voice sharp. "What did you think would happen to you if you went back?" Her weary eyes met his, and despite her exhaustion, there was an unshakable resolve in her gaze. "I don't care," she replied, her voice steady, surprising even him. "I just wanted him to be safe, that's all." For a moment, Josh said nothing, torn between opposing instincts. A part of him, hardened by life's cruelties, wanted to walk away, pretend he'd never seen any of this. It wasn't his problem, after all, but another part, a part of him he thought had vanished with Eliana, couldn't ignore the desperation in her voice or the pain in her eyes. He let out a deep sigh, running a hand down his face. "You can't stay here," he said at last. his voice firm but devoid of hostility. "This barn isn't a place for you or that baby." She started to speak, but he raised his hand, cutting her off. "Come with me," he said. "We'll go into the house. I'm not leaving you out here in the cold and dirt." The woman hesitated, staring at him like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "You're helping us?" she asked cautiously. "Yes, I am," he answered gravely. Walking over to the baby, still sleeping soundly, he gently wrapped the tiny body in his coat. As he held the baby in his arms, something stirred inside him. A sensation he hadn't felt in years, a faint warmth, a flicker of life. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside, and turned back to the woman. "What's your name?" he asked as she approached hesitantly. "Karen," she replied, her voice still trembling. "All right, Karen," Josh said, walking toward the barn door. "Let's go. You and your baby can have some peace, at least for tonight." Karen followed him, her steps slow and unsure, as though she feared he might change his mind. But Josh didn't waver. He glanced back once at Lily, who was now surrounded by her puppies, licking each one with calm dedication. When they reached the house, Lewis, the housekeeper, froze in shock at the sight of Josh walking in with Karen and the baby in his arms. What's going on?" she stammered, nearly dropping the dish towel in her hands. "I'll explain later," Josh replied firmly. "Bring some hot water, clean towels, and see if there's any of Eliana's clothes that might fit her." Lewis, still trying to make sense of everything, hurried back with towels and some old clothes she'd found in the closet that once belonged to Josh's late wife. "She's going to need help getting cleaned up," she said, giving Karen a knowing look that came from years of experience. "Let me take care of her, boss. You can look after the baby in the meantime." Josh hesitated for a moment before nodding. He gently took the baby into his arms again, feeling the fragile weight and warmth of the little body. Holding something so delicate felt almost unnatural to his rough, calloused hands, hardened from years of ranch work. Louis reached out to Karen, helping her to her feet. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you cleaned up," she said, her tone both kind and firm. Karen clung to her and slowly walked toward the bathroom. Meanwhile, Josh stood in the kitchen, gazing down at the baby in his arms as he tried to process everything that had unfolded. He walked over to the sink, where he'd already prepared a basin of warm water. "All right, little guy," he murmured, more to himself than the infant. "Bath time." Carefully, he lowered the baby into the water, using a soft cloth to clean the tiny body. The baby squirmed and let out small grunts, but didn't cry, which Josh took as a good sign. He didn't know much about babies, but memories of Eliana flashed through his mind, how she'd once talked about raising children on the ranch, dreaming of a big family. The thought tightened something in his chest, but he quickly shook it off and focused on his task, ensuring the baby was comfortable and clean. Across the house, in the bathroom, Louis had filled the tub with warm water. She steadied Karen by the arms, helping her step in slowly. "I know you're weak, but you'll feel so much better after this," she said, as Karen nodded silently. "Thank you," Karen whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "No need to thank me," Louisa replied, gently washing the young woman's tangled hair and thin, weary body. "The boss may seem tough, but he's a good man. You're lucky you ended up here." Karen didn't say anything, but the relief in her eyes was evident, something Louisa noted with a quiet satisfaction. Once she finished, Louisa dried her off with care and handed her clean clothes. "All set. Get dressed, and then we'll go see your baby." She waited patiently as Karen got ready and then guided her to the living room. The faint sound of the baby's soft breathing reached Karen's ears before she even entered. When they arrived, Josh was seated in a chair, rocking the baby gently in his arms. The infant was wrapped snugly in a clean blanket, his eyes closed in peaceful sleep. Karen paused in the doorway, her lips trembling with emotion at the sight. Josh glanced up at her. "He's fine. Strong little guy from what I can tell," he said, trying to ease the tension. Karen stepped forward slowly, her arms outstretched. Josh hesitated for a moment before handing the baby over with almost reverent care. As she cradled the child against her chest, an overwhelming expression of love and relief spread across her face. Just then, the faint rumble of an engine signaled the arrival of the doctor Josh had called. He stood and went to the door to greet him, quickly explaining the situation. The doctor, a calm man in his 40s, entered and began examining Karen and the baby. "They're both doing well," he concluded. "The baby's healthy, and the mother is just exhausted. Some nourishing food, rest, and care should get them back on their feet." Josh nodded, a sense of relief washing over him that he hadn't expected. After the doctor left, he returned to the bedroom, where Karen lay on the bed, the baby in her arms and her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You'll stay here," he said firmly, "at least until you're strong enough to decide what comes next." Karen looked up at him, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she murmured. They were safe now, but the memory of finding them in the barn, surrounded by straw and desperation, was still fresh in his mind. That's when he remembered Lily. The dog was exhausted, lying with her newborn puppies, and needed care too. Without a word, Josh abruptly stood and left the room. Louis raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He grabbed a large box from the storage room and hurried out to the barn. Opening the door, he saw Lily still curled up on the straw, her puppies nestled against her. She raised her head when she saw him, wagging her tail faintly, a sign of happiness at his presence, though she was too tired to move. Josh knelt beside her and gently stroked her head. "You need care too, girl," he murmured. Carefully, he began moving the puppies into the box, lining it with a clean blanket to keep them warm. Lily watched him with trusting eyes, as if she knew he'd take care of her. Once all the puppies were settled, Josh lifted Lily in his arms, being mindful not to jostle her, and placed her in the box beside them. Carrying the box with care, he returned to the house. Crossing the living room where Louis was sitting, he placed the box near Lily's bed in the corner, her favorite spot. Gently, he helped her settle next to her puppies, then brought over fresh food and water, setting them close so she wouldn't have to strain. Lily gazed at him with grateful eyes before licking one of her puppies, which let out a soft squeak. The sight stirred something deep in Josh's chest. "Oh my goodness, how adorable!" Louis exclaimed, leaning down to look at the puppies. "Just look at them, boss. 4 of them, each cuter than the last." Josh smiled faintly, still kneeling by Lily. "They seem strong," he said, watching the tiny pups squirm. Louis glanced at him with a playful look. "Think you might let me have one when they're older? I've always wanted a puppy." To her surprise, Josh chuckled, not loudly or extravagantly, but it was a genuine laugh, one that seemed as unexpected to him as it was to her. "Maybe," he replied, shaking his head, "if you promise to take good care of it." Louisa blinked in surprise. It wasn't every day that Josh laughed, let alone joked with someone. She laughed too, waving her kitchen towel at him. "Well, I've seen it all now. The boss laughing? Who would have thought?" Josh shrugged, but there was a spark in his eyes that Louisa hadn't seen before. He seemed different, more alive, and she knew exactly why. Throughout the day, she watched him care for Karen and the baby with a focus she hadn't seen in him before. He made tea for Karen, ensured the baby was wrapped in warm blankets, and even improvised a bottle to feed the infant in case Karen needed a break. He was attentive to every detail, as though taking care of them was the only thing that mattered in that moment. "You've changed, boss," Louisa remarked when she crossed paths with him in the kitchen later. Josh looked up, confused. "I've changed." She smiled. She'd never seen him like this, so concerned, so dedicated. He didn't respond right away, his gaze drifting to Lily, who was peacefully sleeping with her puppies. "Maybe this is what I needed," he said quietly, the words heavy with meaning. Louisa didn't press further. She simply nodded with a knowing smile. Something in Josh had shifted, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. That night, the house was calm. The soft sounds of the puppies and the baby's steady breathing filled the air with a sense of unexpected peace. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow that seemed to lift the heaviness that had hung over the ranch. Karen sat on the couch, nursing the baby, while Josh and Louis worked together in the kitchen, preparing coffee. Life seemed to be settling back into a quiet rhythm, and for the first time in a while, the house felt at ease. But the calm was soon broken by the sound of an approaching car. Josh glanced up, puzzled. It was unusual for anyone to show up unannounced. The hum of the engine was followed by a knock on the door. Josh looked at Louisa, who wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. Karen felt her entire body freeze. That voice, it was unmistakable, with its falsely polite tone and forced kindness masking something much darker. It was him, her husband, her tormentor. Fear gripped her, and before she could think, she clutched the baby tightly to her chest and hurried to the bathroom. In the living room, Louisa watched the man standing at the door. At first glance, he seemed harmless, a well-dressed man with soft features and a polite smile. But there was something unsettling in his eyes that made her uneasy. Before she could respond, Josh appeared, his no-nonsense demeanor filling the space. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Josh asked bluntly, stepping toward the door. The man smiled, but there was a tension in his expression. "My name's Edgar. I'm looking for my wife. She's pregnant and ran away from home. Some people told me she might have come here, so I thought I'd ask if you've seen her." Josh crossed his arms, studying the man carefully. On the surface, Edgar seemed calm, but Josh could read him like a book. He'd seen cowards like this before. The way Edgar's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something, made it clear he wasn't just here for information. "I haven't seen anyone," Josh replied firmly, "and even if I had, that's none of your business." Edgar's smile faltered and his eyes narrowed. "I just want to make sure she's okay. After all, she's carrying my child." Josh felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. His instinct was to throw the man out, but he knew that wouldn't end well. "I already told you, I haven't seen anyone. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." Edgar stepped closer, trying to peer past Josh into the house. "Are you sure? I heard she came here specifically." Josh moved forward, blocking Edgar's view entirely. His face hardened and his tone sharpened. "I told you already. No one's here. Now get off my property before I lose my patience." Edgar hesitated for a moment, clearly realizing Josh wasn't someone to mess with. Finally, he shrugged and turned to leave. "Thanks for your time," he said, his words laced with a thinly veiled threat. Josh watched as Edgar walked back to his car. Only when the vehicle disappeared down the road did he release the breath he'd been holding and relax his shoulders. Stepping back inside, he slammed the door shut and locked it. "Karen!" he called, heading toward the hallway. "It's okay. You can come out now." There was a moment of silence before the bathroom door creaked open. Karen stepped out, trembling, the baby held tightly to her chest. Her eyes were red and brimming with tears, and she looked ready to collapse. Without a word, she took a few hesitant steps before suddenly throwing herself into Josh's arms. For a moment, Josh froze, caught off guard, but then he placed his hands gently on her shoulders, trying to steady her. "It's all right. He's gone," he said in a low, calm voice. Karen sobbed quietly, clutching the baby protectively. "Thank you. Thank you for lying. I don't know what I would have done if he had found me here." Josh shook his head. "It was nothing. But you can't keep running like this. You need to find a way to deal with this." She pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face full of despair. "I can't go to the police. He's dangerous. If I don't have enough evidence and they let him go, he'll come after me. He'll hurt the baby." Josh clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. He wanted to fix everything right then and there, but he knew it wasn't that simple. "You're safe here, for now, but this can't be permanent. We'll figure something out." Karen nodded, still trembling, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. From the kitchen, Louie watched the scene unfold. Shaking her head, she muttered to herself while setting a kettle on the stove. "That man isn't who he pretends to be," she said quietly, a faint smile playing on her lips. The tense air in the house gradually eased, giving way to a cautious calm. Karen managed to rest a little while Josh and Louisa handled the simple tasks that kept the ranch running. The next morning, as Louisa sat with Karen, helping her care for the baby, Josh rode through the high pasture, inspecting fences that needed repair. Zeus trotted steadily as Josh tightened the loose wires on the fence. From the elevated vantage point, he could take in the entire ranch, the sprawling pastures, the corrals, and the house in the distance. He was focused on hammering a new stake into place when something caught his eye. A car was kicking up a faint trail of dust as it approached the entrance to the property. Josh stopped what he was doing and frowned. Visitors were rare, let alone 2 days in a row. The memory of Edgar's visit the day before sent a chill through him. Moving quickly, he reached into the saddlebag strapped to Zeus and pulled out his binoculars. As he adjusted the focus, his heartbeat quickened. The car was the same as yesterday, and inside was the same man, Edgar. Josh's blood boiled. "What does he want now?" he muttered, shoving the binoculars back into the bag. In one swift motion, he mounted Zeus and gripped the reins tightly. The horse bolted toward the house, a trail of dust rising behind them. As he galloped down the hill, Josh kept his eyes fixed on the car, hoping it would head straight to the house. But instead, it stopped beneath a large oak tree about 200 yards from the property. Edgar didn't get out, but Josh could see someone moving inside the vehicle. They were watching the house. Josh clenched his jaw, anger rising in his chest. "Coward!" he spat under his breath, steering Zeus toward the ranch gate. Dismounting quickly, he tied Zeus to the fence and strode into the house with determined steps. In the kitchen, Louis was rinsing fruit for the midday snack, while Karen sat on the couch nursing her baby. Both women looked up as Josh entered, slamming the door behind him. "What's going on, boss?" Louisa asked, setting the dish aside. Josh didn't answer right away. He walked to the windows and yanked the curtains closed, blocking the view from outside. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with tension. "It's him. The man from yesterday. He's back. He didn't come to the door this time, but he's parked near the entrance, watching the house." Karen's face went pale. Her hands trembled as she clutched her baby tighter. "He found me," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "He's going to come in. He's going to hurt us." Before she could spiral into panic, Louisa stepped forward and placed firm hands on Karen's shoulders. "Calm down, child. You're safe here. No one's going to touch you or that baby, not while the boss and I are here." Josh nodded, his expression hard, but his eyes filled with the same determination as Louisa's. "You're not leaving this house," he said firmly. "Stay away from the windows. He can't see you. Louisa, close every curtain in the house. I don't want anyone outside knowing what's going on in here." Karen tried to steady her breathing, but tears started streaming down her face. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He always said he'd find me. He always does." Josh crouched beside the couch, meeting her at eye level. "Look at me," he said, his tone softer but no less resolute. "He's not getting in here. He might try, but it's not happening, not while I'm here." Karen looked at him, her tears still falling, but something in Josh's unwavering expression seemed to ground her. She nodded slowly, struggling to compose herself. Louisa, now in the kitchen, pulling the curtains closed, glanced over her shoulder at Josh. "And you? What are you planning to do about him sitting out there, watching us like a predator stalking its prey?" Josh clenched his fists, his frustration clear. "I don't know yet," he admitted, his voice low but simmering with anger. Hours later, Josh stood by the living room window, peeking out from behind the curtain. Edgar's car was still parked beneath the oak tree, its engine off. Through the windshield, he could see Edgar's silhouette, motionless but alert, keeping a close eye on the house. Josh's patience was wearing thin. His jaw tightened as his anger bubbled closer to the surface. "He's not leaving," he muttered under his breath. Louisa, now back in the kitchen, glanced at him with concern. "What are you going to do, boss? He's just sitting there, but who knows what that man is thinking?" Josh took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm despite the urge to charge outside and end it all by force. He knew he needed to think clearly. Turning to the women, he spoke with authority. "Stay here. Lock the door," he ordered. "And Karen, stay away from the windows." Do you hear me?" Karen nodded shakily, holding the baby so tightly it was as if she thought her embrace alone could protect him. Josh grabbed his shotgun, leaning in the corner of the room, and slung it over his shoulder. Karen's eyes widened. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. Josh looked at her with a firm gaze. "I'm going to end this. He's not going to keep circling my property like he owns the place." Without waiting for a response, Josh opened the door and stepped outside, slamming it shut behind him. When he was just a few feet from the car, Edgar stepped out. His appearance was polished, crisp shirt, neatly tucked, projecting the image of a man who wanted to seem reliable. But Josh saw right through the act. "You again," Josh said, stopping a short distance away. His voice was steady but low, like the growl of a dog on the verge of attack. Edgar flashed a smile, but it was hollow, never reaching his eyes. "I told you, I'm looking for my wife. Still am. Thought she might be around here." Josh tightened his grip on the shotgun. "I already told you yesterday I haven't seen anyone. And I didn't like the way you just showed up out of nowhere, lurking around my place. That's the kind of thing cowards do." Edgar's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "There's no need for insults. I just want to know if she's okay. It shouldn't be so hard to find someone willing to help." Josh took a step forward, tilting his head slightly. "If you care so much, why'd she run from you? Why would a pregnant woman risk running instead of staying home with the man who claims to love her?" For a brief second, Edgar lost his cool. His expression hardened, but he quickly masked it. "She doesn't understand what's best for her," he replied coldly. "Sometimes people need a little discipline to see what's right." A fire ignited in Josh's chest. His instincts screamed to end this right then and there, but he held himself back. "Listen, I'm only going to say this once," Josh said, his voice like steel. "You're going to get back in your car and leave. I don't want to see you or that car on this road again. If you come back, I'll make sure you regret it." Edgar narrowed his eyes, trying to maintain control. "You talk a lot for someone who doesn't know who they're dealing with," he said, his tone laced with a thinly veiled threat. Josh stepped even closer, now inches away, forcing Edgar to lean back slightly. "And you don't know who you're messing with," Josh replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This is my home, my land, and anyone I choose to protect is under my responsibility. If you so much as think about harming her or that baby, I'll take care of you. And trust me, you won't like the outcome." Edgar's eyes flickered between Josh and the shotgun. Weighing his options, he finally stepped back and opened his car door. "This isn't over," he said, before getting inside. Josh watched as Edgar turned the car around and sped off down the dirt road. He stood there a few minutes longer, making sure the man was really gone before heading back to the house. When he stepped inside, he found Karen and Louisa waiting in the living room, their faces full of worry. Karen looked on the verge of tears. "He's gone," Josh said, placing the shotgun in the corner. Karen exhaled sharply, as if she'd been holding her breath the entire time, and began to cry quietly. Josh walked over and knelt beside her. "He's not going to touch you," he said firmly, his voice soft in a way Karen hadn't expected. "I promised you, and I'll keep that promise." She nodded, still trembling, while Louisa brought over a cup of tea to help calm her. Whatever came next, Josh knew Edgar wouldn't give up so easily. But as the days passed, life on the ranch began to feel lighter, almost peaceful. Edgar hadn't shown any signs of returning since their last encounter, and the tension that had gripped the house started to fade. Karen and the baby were recovering well thanks to Josh's constant care and Louisa's dedication. Josh, who had once seemed like a man married only to his work, now spent more time inside the house. He often watched Karen and the baby, his expression a mix of wonder and uncertainty, as if they were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, but had already become essential to his life. Louisa, with her keen eyes and years of wisdom, quickly picked up on the shift. One afternoon, as Josh sat on the porch rocking the baby in his arms, Louisa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, and a knowing smile on her face. "Boss, if I didn't know you didn't have kids, I'd swear you've been a father your whole life," Louisa remarked with a knowing smile. Josh looked at her, startled, then shrugged. "It's not hard. He likes to laugh. Seems like whatever I do makes him happy," he replied, trying to sound indifferent. But there was a gleam in his eyes that Louisa had never seen before. She shook her head, chuckling softly. It wasn't just the baby, it was Karen. Louisa noticed how Josh watched her when he thought no one else was looking. She saw the care he took in ensuring Karen had everything she needed, from comfortable clothes to the tea he made for her every night. It wasn't mere kindness, it was something deeper. Karen, for her part, seemed just as at ease with him. Her smiles came more often now, and the worry that had etched itself into her eyes had softened, replaced by a sparkle Louisa easily recognized. The bond between them was growing stronger, even if neither of them would admit it. Louisa knew it was only a matter of time before one of them said something more. Later that afternoon, Karen appeared on the porch with a notebook in hand. The baby rested in Josh's arms, nearly asleep. "Josh," she called hesitantly. He glanced up, a small smile touching his lips. "Yeah?" "I've been thinking about names for him," she said, looking tenderly at the baby, but unable to decide. Josh fell silent for a moment, caught off guard. His eyes drifted to the baby's sleeping face, the delicate features and peaceful expression. "He looks strong," Josh finally said, "strong and sweet at the same time. Maybe something like Arthur." Karen's face lit up with a smile. "Arthur, I like it. It's strong but gentle too." Josh shrugged again, but the faint curve of a smile tugged at his lips. "If you like it, then it's the right name." "Arthur it is," Karen said softly, leaning down to gently stroke the baby's cheek. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lily's puppies, now slightly older, played around the porch. Lily lay nearby, watching them patiently. Occasionally, one of the pups would scamper by Josh or Karen's feet, drawing soft laughter from them both. The baby, now awake again, giggled each time a puppy approached him, as if he understood the game. Josh watched the scene quietly, but Louisa, passing by with a basket of laundry, noticed the look in his eyes. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper. He wasn't only taking care of Karen and Arthur, he was falling for them. Karen, meanwhile, seemed equally charmed. Every time Josh did something for the baby, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something more, something she wasn't ready to admit even to herself. Their glances at each other had grown longer, more intense. These weren't quick exchanges anymore. They were moments where time seemed to pause, leaving the two of them caught in each other's presence, as though something unspoken hung in the air. But neither dared to voice it. That evening, when Josh went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, he found Louisa setting the table. She greeted him with a smile that suggested she knew far more than she should. "You know you care about them, don't you?" Josh stopped in his tracks, narrowing his eyes. "What are you talking about, Louisa?" She shook her head, laughing gently. "I see how you look at them, at her and Arthur. You don't have to pretend nothing's happening. It's sweet, you know." Josh glanced away, trying to hide the faint blush creeping across his face. "I'm just doing what's right, taking care of them." "Of course you are," Louisa said, with a tone that made it clear she didn't believe him. "But boss, sometimes what's right is also what your heart wants." Josh didn't respond. He simply nodded and left the kitchen, but her words lingered in his mind far longer than he cared to admit. The next morning, the stillness of the ranch was shattered by a piercing scream. "Josh! Josh!" Louisa stood at the door of the house, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. Josh bolted upright, rushing out of bed as Louisa's desperate voice echoed through the hall. "Boss, it's Lily! Come quickly, please!" she cried, her voice trembling with urgency. Karen woke too, startled by the commotion. She leapt out of bed, clutching Arthur, who began crying from the sudden noise. Heart pounding, she ran toward the living room, where she found Louisa by the door and Josh already dashing toward the porch. Josh's chest felt heavy as he sprinted across the room and flung the porch door open, and then he saw her. Lily lay on the porch floor, her body convulsing uncontrollably. Foam covered her mouth, and her eyes stared blankly, almost lifeless. Each spasm felt like a blow to Josh's chest, but it was the piece of paper tied to her collar that froze his blood. Kneeling beside her, his hands trembling, Josh untied the note. The paper was smeared, but the message was unmistakable. "You chose to protect them. Now you'll pay the price." It had to be Edgar. It could only be him. Josh's blood ran cold, but in that moment, all that mattered was saving Lily. Gently, he scooped her into his arms. Despite her limp body and violent tremors, she felt so fragile, so small, and the vacant look in her eyes tore him apart. He gently placed Lily in the passenger seat, wrapping her in blankets to keep her from being jostled during the drive. Turning the ignition, he tore down the driveway so quickly that a cloud of dust rose in his wake. His heart pounded as fast as the truck's engine as he sped toward the vet. The road felt endless, each second stretching unbearably. When he finally arrived at the clinic, Dr. James, an old friend and trusted veterinarian, rushed outside as soon as he saw Josh's truck screech to a halt. "She's been poisoned," Josh said through gritted teeth, handing Lily carefully into James's arms. "Do something, please." Dr. James didn't waste a second. He carried Lily inside, immediately administering an antidote and beginning a detox treatment to flush out the poison. He monitored her breathing closely as Josh stood nearby, helpless and desperate. Time seemed frozen. Josh, usually a stoic man, couldn't hold back the tears. He sank into a corner of the waiting room, burying his face in his hands. The thought of losing Lily was unbearable. She wasn't just his dog, she was his most loyal companion, the one constant in his darkest years. Back at the ranch, Louisa paced the house, whispering quiet prayers. "She doesn't deserve this," she murmured under her breath. Meanwhile, Karen sat on the couch with Arthur in her arms, silent tears streaming down her face. "I have to leave," Karen suddenly said, standing abruptly. "Leave? Where would you go?" Louisa asked, alarmed. "I can't stay here. This happened because of me. He did this to Lily because of me. If I stay, things will only get worse." "Josh doesn't deserve this," Karen said, her voice breaking with guilt. Louisa stepped forward, placing firm hands on Karen's shoulders. "You're not going anywhere, sweetheart. And the baby? Where would you take him? Josh is risking everything to protect you both. Don't throw that away. Wait until he's back. We'll figure this out together." Karen hesitated, the weight of her guilt still heavy on her shoulders. "But what if he comes back? What if he hurts someone else? I can't risk that. I can't endanger anyone else's life." Louisa shook her head, her voice steady and resolute. "Trust Josh. He'll do whatever it takes to keep you and Arthur safe. He's already proven that. Now sit down and wait. Let's pray Lily pulls through." Karen reluctantly sank back onto the couch, tears flowing freely. All she could do was wait and hope. At the clinic, hours crawled by. Finally, Dr. James emerged from the treatment room, finding Josh in the same corner, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "I think we pulled her through," James said with a faint smile. "It was close, but she's going to make it. She'll need rest and care. But she's strong, Josh. Very strong." Relief washed over Josh, leaving him momentarily speechless. He stood, gripping James's hand tightly. "Thank you, James. Thank you." He walked into the treatment room, where Lily lay weak but alive. Her eyes fluttered open, and her tail gave the faintest wag. It was enough to fill Josh's heart with gratitude. He gently stroked her fur, whispering, "You did it, girl. I'm so proud of you." In that moment, he made a silent vow. Edgar would pay for what he'd done. As the sun began to set, Josh's truck rolled back into the ranch. Dust still hung in the air as he stepped out, cradling Lily carefully in his arms. Though she was weak, her half-closed eyes and faint tail wag showed she recognized her home. Louisa was the first to rush out, her apron still tied around her waist, her face full of concern. "Is she going to be okay, boss?" she asked anxiously. Josh stopped on the porch, looking at Louisa and Karen, who had come outside with Arthur in her arms. He nodded, taking a deep breath before answering. "Dr. James said it was close, but she's going to recover. She's as strong as ever." Louisa covered her face with her hands, overcome with emotion. Karen exhaled deeply, her worry slightly easing but not disappearing entirely. Josh carried Lily inside and gently placed her on her bed next to her puppies. They immediately scampered toward her, letting out small whimpers. Though weak, Lily tried to lick one of them, her energy barely enough to move. Josh knelt beside her, softly running his hand over her fur. "You did it, girl. You're amazing," he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. Karen, however, seemed uneasy. Though she shared the joy over Lily's condition, her hands trembled slightly as she held Arthur close to her chest, clutching him as if to shield him from the world. Josh noticed her distant expression and rose from his seat. "Karen, what's wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. "I can't stay here anymore, Josh," she said, her voice unsteady. "This happened because of me. Edgar, he's not going to stop. What if he hurts someone else? What if he hurts you?" Josh shook his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This wasn't your fault, Karen. What Edgar did is on him, not you. You're not responsible for someone else's cruelty." "But I'm a burden," she replied, her voice trembling. "You've already done so much for me and Arthur, and now this. I can't let you or anyone else get hurt because of me." Josh took a step closer, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. "Listen to me, Karen. You are not a burden. You and Arthur brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing. Before you came along, I was empty. I was just going through the motions, not really living. Now, I can't imagine my days without you two." Karen looked up at him, startled. She hadn't expected such words. "I don't want you to leave," Josh continued, now taking her hands in his. "I want you to stay because, Karen, you and Arthur, you're my family now. And if I have to face Edgar 100 times to protect you, I will." Karen froze, her eyes locked on his. Josh, sensing the weight of the moment, stepped even closer. "I don't believe it's just chance that brought you and Arthur into my life," he said softly. He hesitated, gathering his courage. "And I need to tell you, I'm completely in love with you. From the first moment I held Arthur, I knew he was more than just a baby who showed up here. He feels like a son to me. And you, Karen, you're everything I never knew I needed." A single tear slid down Karen's cheek, but it wasn't sadness. It was pure, overwhelming emotion. Never in her life had anyone spoken to her with such care and love. "Josh," she began, but her voice broke. He cupped her face in his rough but surprisingly gentle hands. "I love you, and I love Arthur. Don't go. Stay. We'll face this together." Karen looked into his eyes, tears now sparkling with a newfound strength. Slowly, she nodded, a soft smile breaking through her trembling lips. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Josh smiled, a warmth lighting up his entire face. "Then stay," he said simply. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned in, closing the small space between them. And in that moment, time seemed to stop. Josh, understanding her unspoken gesture, closed the gap entirely, their lips meeting in a gentle, tender kiss. It was filled with everything they had both kept locked away, promises of a future they could now envision together. From the doorway, Louie watched discreetly, her lips curving into a knowing smile. Shaking her head, she murmured softly to herself before retreating quietly to the kitchen, leaving them alone. Josh and Karen stayed there for a long moment, their faces still close, as if the weight of their fears had finally lifted. For the first time, the house felt at peace, the shadows of fear giving way to something brighter. Hope. Outside on the porch, Lily sighed gently in her sleep, surrounded by her newborn puppies. Inside, Arthur rested peacefully in his crib, cradled by the calm and safety that now filled the air. But suddenly, the distant hum of an engine broke through the quiet. A car was approaching. Josh froze, the sound pulling him to attention. His fork clattered onto the plate as he stood, his senses on high alert. Moving swiftly, he went to the window, pulling the curtain aside with a cautious hand. His heart pounded as he braced himself for more trouble, but to his surprise, the car outside wasn't Edgar's. It was a police cruiser. "It's the police," Josh said, his tone serious. Karen stiffened immediately, her eyes wide as she instinctively pulled Arthur closer to her chest. "Go to the bedroom," Josh instructed firmly. "Close the door and stay there until I tell you it's safe." Karen hesitated, but the resolute expression on Josh's face left no room for debate. She stood and hurried to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her. Meanwhile, Louis stayed in the kitchen, watching the situation unfold with her usual calm but observant demeanor. Josh approached the door and opened it. Standing there was Julio, a man he recognized but had only exchanged brief greetings with around town. "Good afternoon, Josh," Julio greeted, adjusting his belt as he glanced around. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Josh gave a slight nod. "Good afternoon. You're not interrupting, but what brings you here?" Julio sighed, removing his hat as he spoke. "We're looking for a pregnant red-haired woman who might have passed through here recently. Her name is Karen." Josh's heart raced, but his face remained composed. "Why are you looking for her? What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "We need to inform her about her boyfriend, Edgar," Julio replied gravely. "His car was found overturned on a dirt road last night. Edgar was dead inside the vehicle." Josh stood motionless, though an undeniable sense of relief coursed through him. He knew he shouldn't feel it, but he couldn't help himself. "What happened?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "The investigation suggests he was drunk," Julio explained. "Looks like he lost control of the car and it flipped. All signs point to an accident." Josh exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if in somber reflection. His expression conveyed a mix of false regret and an underlying need to process the news. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I can't help you. If I see the woman you're looking for, I'll let you know," Josh said evenly. Julio nodded, placing his hat back on. "We'd appreciate it if you could." "Thanks for your time, Josh." The officer climbed back into the cruiser, started the engine, and drove away. Only when the vehicle disappeared from view did Josh let the relief fully settle over him. He shut the door firmly and walked to the bedroom. Knocking lightly, he called out, "Karen, you can come out now." The door opened slowly, and Karen emerged holding Arthur tightly. Her anxious eyes met his. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. "Edgar's dead," Josh said plainly, though he softened his tone. "They found his car overturned on a dirt road. He was drunk, and it looks like it was an accident." Karen's eyes widened, shock etched across her face. Slowly, however, her expression shifted. The initial surprise gave way to a visible sense of relief that she couldn't conceal. She took a deep breath, as though a heavy weight had finally lifted from her shoulders. "Karen, you don't have to carry that burden anymore," Josh said gently. "What happened was the result of his own choices. The only thing that matters now is that you and Arthur are safe and free." Karen nodded slowly, the fear that had gripped her for so long beginning to dissolve. In the kitchen, Louis listened quietly, closing her eyes for a moment in silent gratitude. She knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, peace seemed within reach in this house. In the months that followed, life at Sol Naciente Ranch entered a new chapter. Edgar's shadow no longer loomed over them, and for the first time, the days felt calm and purposeful. Arthur grew strong and happy, surrounded by love and care. Josh couldn't imagine a day without the boy in his arms or without Karen's smile brightening his world. One day, Josh made a decision he had been contemplating for a while. He wanted Arthur to be his son, officially. When he shared his intentions with Karen, she was overcome with emotion. "You don't have to do this, Josh," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're already the father he never would have had." "I do have to," Josh replied firmly. "Because he is my son. He has been since the day I held him for the first time, and I want to make it official." The process was swift, and soon Arthur carried Josh's last name. The sense of pride and fulfillment Josh felt was unparalleled. Arthur wasn't just his son in name, but in every way that mattered. As time passed, the love between Josh and Karen grew undeniable. On a quiet afternoon while walking through the orchard, Josh stopped and gently took Karen's hand. He knelt before her, a simple box in his hand. "Karen," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you changed my life. You gave me a reason to believe again. I don't want to spend a single day away from you or Arthur. I want us to be a family forever. Will you marry me?" Karen brought her hands to her face, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, Josh, 1,000 times yes." What an incredible journey of love, redemption, and hope. Their story reminds us all that even in the darkest moments, there's a chance for new beginnings and unexpected blessings. It's about family, the bonds we create, and the courage to embrace the future despite the pain of the past. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who could use a little inspiration, and subscribe for more amazing stories just like this one. And hey, let us know in the comments what part of this story moved you the most. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, stay safe, stay inspired, and keep spreading love. See you in the next video.